what struck me was how aesthetically intelligent the audience was. And these are not art historians, they're not even necessarily designers. They're just people who intuitively understood and, given the right mechanism, could express that they felt this term elevated, carried this history or tradition with it.
To continue with our series where we decode what clients mean when they use ambiguous creative language, this week we tested, what does elevated look like?
We try not to anticipate an answer. Sometimes it's helpful if we really have a strong suspicion that something is going to be effective or successful to test the thesis, right? Test the idea and see if we're right. But for these tests, the more interesting things come about when we don't know what the answers are going to be. So I worked with my wife on this one. She does a lot of wedding invitation design and things of that nature. So I thought she'd be the perfect person to ask what looks elevated. And so we worked together and found the things that we felt most looked elevated and intuitively liked.
2 boards were created and tested, and the outcome was super interesting. We learned something about how people perceive this idea of elevated design.
As soon as we saw the results, I could pick up on what was going on really, really quickly. The positive and negative boards, I think, are really, really clear. If you put them side by side and zoom in and you kind of take a art history approach to these, the ones on the left are much more traditional, much more classic in their form, in the typesetting in particular. This looks really nice to me. I like it.
I liked that one as well. I voted it as elevated, but
It's really nice, but it's new, right? This kind of typesetting wasn't even possible, say, 100 years ago for sure. And I picked up on this before we ran the AI report, but that window of elevated seems to fall between the 1850s and the 1920s. And that's my favorite period in art history because you still have this classical old world sensibility and elegance, and we're just starting to think in Western culture about form and function. And it's not really until after World War II that you get into all the crazy typesetting. I guess leading up to World War II, a lot of the crazy typesetting and experimental stuff that now we're very, very familiar with. But apparently, for our audience at least, elevated means traditional. You have very classic typesetting with large headline, subtle subheadline. We have different monogrammic lockup structures. And you're not seeing type kind of strewn out with very, spooky, right? A little bit spooky imagery here. It's embossed, it's really pretty, but it's trying really, really hard compared to this, where there's this confidence that comes from experience, I would say, from tradition. It's almost like the contrast between old money and new money in some ways, right? This is very nice. I like this. However, the type is highly experimental and in the grand scheme of history, a really, really new thing that you couldn't do, that far back.
and not to say that that stuff isn't pretty and that you can't use it, but if you are wanting that super elevated feel, then you should go with the more traditional stuff. And our audience wasn't prompted or anything and weren't probably thinking about the history at all when they were taking the test. They were just going with what intuitively felt right. So to see these patterns emerge is just super cool.
Yeah, and that was something that really jumped out at me from this test. I taught the history of design for 15 years. It's something I'm passionate about and super nerdy about. I've, read all the textbooks. I have taught all the textbooks. I have done deep dives on different periods and studied the various artists that pop up in the textbooks and read their biographies and things like that. Just a nerdy thing I'm really into. And so I've got a fairly developed, taste and vocabulary for these things. But what struck me was how intuitively, maybe emotionally even, or aesthetically intelligent the audience was. And these are not art historians, they're not even necessarily designers. They're just people who intuitively understood and, given the right mechanism, could express that they felt this term elevated, carried this history or tradition with it that we see in the left. It's a little bit absent on the right. Not that this is bad or anything like that, but this to them was elevated.
When we used the anchoring feature, something interesting happened too. Even the responses that looked like outliers didn't really disrupt the pattern we were seeing.
We anchored some of the things that were contested and some of the things that were even ranked negative for quote unquote elevated here. And that'll move this one swatch over here.
But when we tracked that person's decisions across the rest of the test, their overall preference still leaned surprisingly traditional.
Let's just take this texture one as an example, right? So there's only one green point on here. So if I anchor that one green point and see what that person chose, just that one person, and we scroll down to the resonance arrays, like by and large, it hasn't changed much. This one moved over. They liked that as well. That was previously in the negative category. But the rest are all the very traditional in their typesetting. This one too, I really like this one. We talked a little bit about that one. So if we come over here to swatch 10 and anchor that for the two positives to see what those two people liked and didn't like only, you can see by and large, they felt the more traditional things were in this category of elevated as well.
What looked like exceptions actually reinforced the larger trend. And that was the surprising part. Not that the outliers existed, but how little they changed the overall story that the data was telling.
The individuals who picked any given swatch here in the negative category, everything else that they picked ranked as elevated was really, really traditional in its typesetting and its appearance. It just had this classicism to it. That tells me an even stronger story. I think it's a really strong case that if you want something to feel elevated, go traditional, go classic with it.
Before we continue with the video, you know that moment when the client says, I just don't love it, and the timeline's slipping, the revisions are stacking up, the budget's bloating, and no one can actually tell you how to fix it? With Constellations, you test ideas first with real people. From a few stakeholders to thousands of your actual audience, you get heat maps showing where they've pulled in, where they push back, and where they're just not seeing it. The resonance and resistance arrays make the patterns obvious, and the reporting tells you why people are responding the way that they are and what to do with it. So you walk in already knowing. Go to constellations.app to learn more and see if you qualify for a free test run with our analysts on a project you're already working on. Now let's get back to the report.
The strongest asset I think any designer has, especially in the age of AI, is going to be a strong foundation in what things have meant historically, and then a layer on top of it with constellations, you can get some of those more nebulous words, right? We didn't ask what looks classical or traditional. We asked what looks elevated, and that association is very strong for our audience at least.
And the AI report ended up highlighting a lot of the same patterns we noticed ourselves.
So, key insight, the opposite of elevated is not unrefined, it's self-aware. Several rejected images are technically excellent, foiled, embossed, restrained, beautifully set, but they fail because the design feels authored. The resonance images succeed because they read as inherited. And I thought that was a very elegant or elevated way to state this, right? It's inherited, it's traditional, it's passed on, authored. It's a little more forceful. It's trying really hard. Again, this one, I love this one. I really like it. I think it's beautiful. I think it's very well done, but it's trying. It's definitely trying to get your attention, and it makes it feel like something else.
I think that word inherited too reminds me of the edgy test as well, because it was people want to feel the history, I guess. Even with elevated, like it needs to be something that was inherited, came from the past. And then with edgy, it didn't want to be something that was performative. It had to be something that was like weathered and went through the test of time. So it's interesting to see that pattern through all of these tests that we're doing.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, like it might be interesting to run a follow-up test, even if it's with a small group, and ask with these swatches that we did for the elevated one, what looks edgy? Because I would bet in the context of what we've selected, this would pass for edgy with that selection. It's a little bit rebellious, if you will. So some of the strategic implications that it gives us: serif type, classical character, monogrammic lockup structure, restrained color palettes, really limited color palettes. I think most of the swatches we had in the test were pretty restrained to begin with, but those were the ones that only had one or two colors that came forward.
And it didn't even need to be a neutral because there was that royal blue that was so pretty. It was just not multiple.
hmm But this to me was the one that jumped out before the AI even touched this. The pre-modernist heritage reference. They all look, 1850s to 1920s. They all predate truly mechanized production. You see in the 50s and 60s moving forward into the digital age, where conceptual brand narratives try to take over at that point in history. It becomes a little more forced. They try to adopt these things, then they try to manufacture these traditional things and rebel against them in some way.
You can read the full report from this study at constellations.app. While you're there, explore how Constellations helps creative teams gain clarity, or share an idea you'd like us to explore in a future study.